Welcome to this, what I think is going to be a really exciting session, hearing from people about who inspired them and who they hope to be inspiring them tomorrow. My name is Peter Murray, I'm Chairman of New London Architecture, and each of our speakers is going to be kept to just 5 minutes, keep it very tight, and then we're going to have time for a Q&A and a bit of discussion, so do get your questions ready while you're listening. For those of you who aren't familiar with New London Architecture, we are a centre for the built environment, Store Street, just off Tottenham Court Road, and we host a busy programme of events, seminars, have a large model of London that shows all the changes that are taking place to the city. And yesterday we launched our annual survey of tall buildings in London, showing that tall buildings numbers were continuing to grow. 510 last year, that's now grown to a pipeline of 541 this year. So tall buildings are a key part of delivering more homes for London and a key part of creating a denser city. So we're also obviously here looking at aspects about sustainability, and we have at NLA a sustainability program which brings together the built environment community to share strategies for a city in a period of changing climates. So we've got 7 speakers, so they will have to keep to time if we're going to meet our schedule. And so they're, as I say, going to talk about people who inspire them. And our first speaker is Zohra Chiheb, and she's the regeneration manager at the London Borough of Croydon, and she's going to tell us who has inspired her. Over to you.
Hello, I'm Zohra Chiheb. I work at Croydon Council. I'm not the regeneration manager, I'm just one of the regeneration managers. I'm also an architect. So last week I went to see the Living with Buildings exhibition at the Welcome Collection. It was the last weekend, and I was really amused to see a poster from the 90s a local council had made to advertise a community celebration day of blowing up some of their old post-war tower blocks. Quite eerily dystopian, I think, to turn the destruction of hundreds of former homes into a community day out. And I think there's a particularly special kind of irony that we're now once again building these large tower blocks. So I'm going to celebrate the modernists who built these blocks as my heroes of today. They really inspired me throughout my studies and my career, building social housing with a kind of utopian idealism at their hearts. Lebetkin, who believed that nothing was too good for ordinary people, or the Smithsons, who did the now ill-fated Robin Hood's Gardens. For many of the millions who moved out of slum conditions in the 60s and 70s and into these blocks, they experienced a huge rise in their living conditions. But some of these buildings were badly designed, some were badly managed, many were badly maintained. But if this development built with such lofty intentions turned into the slums of the future so quickly, how can we avoid doing this again? I think the answer lies in building mixed communities. We've got precious city land to build on, and we need to build enough housing that's affordable to a range of people who live there, and add in a resilient mix of businesses, because they're going to ensure that the revenue is there in order to pay for the future, and that's including the ongoing maintenance of these buildings. So I'm going to just pull out some key issues for today and then think about my heroes for tomorrow. So 3 key issues. Affordability. It's said that 80% of the homes we build in London are only affordable to 8% of Londoners. So there's a complete disconnect between incomes and house prices. But for me, a sustainable city is one that's affordable to live in, and most of our housing is currently being built in a model that isn't delivering housing that's affordable to the majority. So councils, I passionately believe, need to get involved in building affordable homes. Another thing is housing numbers. The London Plan's figures for new house building, especially in the outer London boroughs, is eye-watering. And to meet them, we need to definitely be building at the rates that haven't been seen since we were building these tower blocks in the post-war period. But it's not just about housing. We've got the so-called decline of the high street, rising land values, rising rents, rising business rates, and the rise of online shopping is all proving to be a fatal cocktail for many small businesses. An answer could be that the councils need to lead on the economic stewardship of our cities. We need to create long-term investment structures, we need to partner with patient investors, and we need to look for returns over a long period of time. We need to broaden out those who have a stake in the economy through encouraging small and medium-sized businesses. So to pull out some of my heroes, I'm going to celebrate the work of some fellow local authorities. In Liverpool, the council are working closely with the residents of Granby Land Trust. It was originally a residents' association which was set up to protest against demolition of homes, but now they're partnering with the council to develop affordable homes through refurbishment. Granby Land Trust is a community land trust, and this is an entity which is a way of holding land in trust in perpetuity for the community, creating permanently affordable homes. Another hero for me is Waltham Forest Council. They're doing residential-led development in the Black Horse Road area, which shows how an area can grow and develop whilst retaining its sense of identity. It's a former industrial area, but they're building 4,000 new homes. But they're doing this really successfully through mixed use. It's a high street that's more than just retail. There's makers space, business space, incubator space, and it's all in the middle of their residential development. But this isn't the utopian idealism of the modernists. Councils really need to work to support sustainable mixed development to ensure there's actually going to be revenue streams in the future, partly to fund this maintenance that we need, so we don't end up building buildings that are going to be torn down again. So my conclusions are to learn the lessons from the past for a flexible future sustainable city and avoid building developments that will become unloved and will need to be pulled down. My heroes of tomorrow are investing in mixed communities. They're the councils helping to deliver the number of homes we need, affordable, and part of holistic regeneration that supports businesses as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, our next speaker is from a practice that has actually inspired a whole generation relating to how you design buildings that are sustainable and energy efficient. And so please welcome Simon Erridge, Director of Bennetts Associates.
Thank you. I should have some slides, I think. Some presentation is up. Great. Okay. I'm not one to put people on a pedestal necessarily, but I'm going to be talking about the influences from our work as a practice over the last 25 years, from the very beginnings of looking at sustainable architecture through to the situation we find ourselves in now. And I'm going to go back to education. I was educated at the University of Bath in the 1980s. This looks like the 60s, but actually it's the 80s. It was an integrated education of structure, services, and architecture, sharing modules. And that kind of what we now call collaboration is at the absolute essence of sustainable architecture. You can't do sustainable buildings without understanding all of those disciplines. So I want to celebrate the heroes who set up that university back in the 1980s. I joined Rab and Denise Bennetts in the 90s, and we had some really inspiring clients who wanted to change the workplace. They wanted to create buildings for people to work in. They recognized things that we now call well-being. At that time, we called it low energy, natural ventilation, passive design, and we created buildings that were inspiring different kinds of places that transform workplaces that until that time had looked like this. And this is literally a client workplace we walked into in the 90s, cables everywhere, computers everywhere. There was a changing of the guard. People working in those places became more important than the property owners and the property developers who were putting them together, and that created some inspiring architecture. The next people I want to celebrate are the tech pioneers of the 90s, the people who developed software like this, which is TAS by EDSL, and it's a pixelated 2D image, but actually it was the software that allowed us to predict how buildings were going to perform for the first time, so we could actually objectively design buildings knowing how we thought they were going to perform. A huge, huge step forward for us in creating sustainable architecture. And then when we got onto site and built them, the culture then developed to measuring those buildings. And then all of those post-occupancy pioneers like Bill Bordas and others who were looking at coming back into buildings and seeing how well they worked. Hugely important to begin to measure buildings. And then, of course, as a practice, we started to look at comparing and benchmarking buildings and using that data to develop and improve our own buildings. And if it hadn't been for those pioneers, we wouldn't have been able to do that and create that level of information. By the 2000s, we'd reduced energy and use significantly. We began to look at embodied energy, and this is a big new timber frame building we've just completed. That came out of, again, work from the University of Bath, generating a database of carbon embodied in building materials. And that database is the foundation of everything we do now in terms of reducing embodied carbon in buildings and lifetime design, and is creating the kind of architecture we work with today. I wasn't sure whether I should celebrate legislation, but here it is. It's not affected those pioneering people we're working with, but it's brought the baseline up in terms of building performance over the years. So it's been a significant factor. Infrastructure is hugely important. Clients here like Argent at King's Cross developing networks of energy systems within areas of the city, really understanding that different uses coming together with different energy demands are the way to develop sustainable cities of the future. It's not about individual buildings or green bling on those buildings, it's about master planning and big-scale energy master planning. So what about the future? Well, I think it's gone over to the young people now who are saying, we're still not doing well enough. We had a wake-up call last year with a climate conference. We've got children going out on strike saying, we are not doing enough to save our planet. And they're right. We've come so far, but it takes that generation of younger people to come forward to convince us to do more. And who do we look to lead that future? Do we look to our governments? Do we look to a kind of global influence? I think they're probably too busy getting mixed up in politics to be leading those kind of global charges on climate change. So we're focusing really much more on the input of the individual. And at Bennetts Associates, my heroes now are all the people who work for us who have all mapped their individual carbon footprints. We plot them out. We begin to look individually at how we can improve our personal carbon footprints in the world. So it's not just about buildings, it's about people, and it's about the organisation we work with. And finally, coming together with an organisation called Science-Based UK to map those carbon reduction targets against global climate change. So it's gone from a situation where we've talked about buildings and how they work to how people can come together and collaborate and deal with much wider global issues. And that's a selection of the people, I guess, who've influenced us and the organisations who've influenced us over the years. Thank you very much.
Very good. Now, our next speaker is one of those people who really makes sure that architects meet those science-based targets. So, Marie-Louise Schembri is a project manager at Hilson, Moran.
I also have a presentation. Thank you. Okay, I am going to put some people on a pedestal, and I'm tackling the subject a little bit more literally. When I was first approached by the NLA to join the discussion panel, I realized very quickly that I had quite a distorted idea of what the hero was. So you can change slide. Here we go. Okay. And it's a distorted idea because it's very much influenced by a popularized or mythological definition of what a hero is. And it immediately brought to mind brash, popular, colorful, gifted, having something to hide. And yes, these heroes, these mythological heroes, also have they're also noble and courageous achievers, as well, to match the Oxford definition of hero. But why is this relevant? Because when I started to think about who my heroes are, who I think the pioneers in the sustainable built environment are, they didn't fit the popularized description of hero. And I think this is an issue because the children, the future generation, is probably growing in a world where there's a distorted idea of what a hero should be or what a hero looks like. So I'm going to use 3 examples very quickly of heroes of the past. The first example is Harold Orr. He's credited with building the first passive house, or the thing that's resembled passive house most of all, the Sketchuan house. It was built in 1977. What this meant is that building designers had to become building physicists. They couldn't be generalists anymore. The home had to be engineered. And this has been very influential, not just with the passive house, but our building regulations and building regulations across the world. How did he do it? First of all, he didn't do it alone. He did it with a group of people who were commissioned by local authority in a panic reaction to the oil embargo of 1973. Second example is Robert McNeill. He is the inventor of one of the most versatile pieces of software that's being used now, or one of the most common uses is for parametric modeling visualization, which is not only used for geometric optimization and structural, but also environmental, and we're using it quite heavily as well. He works with a team of people who have invented apps that enable the flexibility and accessibility of this software tool. So now building designers have to also be coders and scripters to make full use of this opportunity, and it's changing the way that we design. But perhaps we should credit people who preceded him. For example, Susan Kare, who was a pioneer in the user interface with Mac, or go even further back to Grace Hopper, first programmers at her time, and a long way back to the inventors of the analytical computer. Where do you draw the line? This is to make the point that today's heroes very often comes after a list of a long line of researchers, of heroes, of people who have achieved big things over time. And my third example is a publication, a very influential publication, the Health and Wellbeing and Productivity in Offices. This publication brought research and evidence about how design affects employees to the attention of employers in a language they understand. And it's changed the way we design quite dramatically. Maybe it's the beginnings of it, but we're seeing it not just in workspace design, but also in the design of homes, public realms, amenity space, etc. And the WELL standards is a derivative of this publication. But of course, the list of credits is a very long one, and I couldn't even find pictures of the 4 main contributors to this publication. These are all heroes, and of course they follow on a list of researchers that put that evidence together in the first place. So now building designers are having to design healthy spaces and not just functional, beautiful, and user-centric ones. So to conclude, next page. There's a high probability that this building is quite full of the heroes of tomorrow, the sustainability heroes of tomorrow. They are probably the team players, the people who work behind the scenes, and the people who really believe that there's another issue to face, another challenge, an environmental challenge, and they want to do something about it. So it's our responsibility to make sure that they're surrounded by thought leaders, game changers, people who aren't afraid to speak up, and people who aren't afraid of disruption. So we have to be the leaders and have to nurture the heroes of the future. It's a huge responsibility we have, and I think we might have to change the definition of our perception of what a hero is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now our next speaker is one of those people who is helping to fill the gap in the public sector to deliver high-quality design, high-quality parts of the city as they are developed by local authorities under great stress because of financial cuts. And the person who founded public practice is Finn Williams, our next speaker.
Thank you, Peter. So I've got an unlikely source of inspiration, and it's an anecdote told by a pop musician about going to a celebrity's housewarming party in New York in the 1970s, so bear with me. And it's a story told by Brian Eno about arriving in a really rundown area of New York with potholes, no street lighting, drug addicts slumped in doorways. And once he was inside, he found a loft apartment furnished at great expense to the latest fashion. And still kind of shocked by the neighborhood he'd just come through, Eno asked his host whether she liked living here. And she said, of course, this is the best place I've ever lived. And that made him realize that they had different ideas of here. His here was the neighborhood, and her here was everything that she could lock up behind her front door. That led him to coin the idea of the big here and the Long Now, which went on to influence the creation of the Long Now Foundation in the 90s, co-founded by Stuart Brand. And Brand's writing, including The Clock of the Long Now, of course the Whole Earth catalogue, and particularly How Buildings Learn, had a big effect on me as a student in expanding my ideas of what architecture could be. And I've often used that concept of the big here and the long now to help question who I design for, the scale I design at, the timescales I design in. So should we be designing for a client or the wider society? Is our site the red line boundary or the place it's part of? Are buildings finished when they open, or are they just getting started? And asking these questions actually led me to join Croydon Council about 10 years ago now. And so much of my work there was really about trying to stretch developers or politicians' ideas of what's here and what's now. Because I think you can only make genuinely sustainable decisions by working within a wider framework that goes beyond individual self-interest or short-term returns. You can only tackle major environmental challenges like flooding by widening our idea of here, or you can only make the economics of renewable energy work by lengthening our idea of now. It also seemed to me like there was probably one dimension missing, a wider we. For example, you can only make regeneration, as we've heard, socially sustainable by serving a wider public. Actually, a few months ago, the economist Mariana Mazzucato amazingly invited me to take part in a conversation with Brian Eno at the British Library. And somehow, unsurprisingly, he'd already thought of all that. He just called it the bigger me. And that conversation helped me realize how rapidly our perspectives have been shrinking over the past few decades. I think our idea of here has been shrinking, whether through developments increasingly substituting social infrastructure with internal private amenity, the abolition of strategic planning, or to zoom out further still, perhaps even our loss of faith in the EU. Our idea of now is, of course, also shortening, whether it's the lifespan of buildings and building products, short-term economic models based on return on capital employed, driving house building, or even the President of the United States inventing policy on Twitter. And our idea of we also seems to be narrowing, whether it's architects serving an increasingly narrow public, or the algorithms creating filter bubbles around us through social media. That all might sound depressing, but what inspires me now is a new generation of practitioners, not all as young as Greta Thunberg, who realise this isn't working, but something needs to change. And that it's actually building beyond a kind of alternative field into what seems to me like the beginning of quite a significant movement. Public practice is really swept up in and along by this movement, so we're placing outstanding built environment practitioners on year-long placements within forward-thinking local authorities and really trying to rebuild the public sector's capacity to plan proactively. So a few years ago, when I joined Croydon Council, there was probably hardly anything less cool to do than being a public servant and being a planner. But now hundreds of really inspiring planners and architects, urbanists and others are actually applying to Public Practices programme to do just that. It's really inspiring people like Tom Fox, an urban designer who he placed in a joint role across St Albans and Dacorum, helping them to work beyond administrative boundaries to plan Hemel Garden communities as a kind of bigger here. People like Latricia Pancrazi, a specialist in sustainability, environmental science and social justice, who will be helping Ashford to plan for a longer now by introducing the circular economy across a whole series of different council departments. And people like Hannah Lambert, who's co-designing Newham's first council-led estate regeneration project just down the road in Custom House, really closely together with local residents, so working with that wider we. These associates are quietly showing how local authorities can actually lead a way of planning for a bigger here, a longer now, a wider we. So my theory is that somewhere deep down, Brian Eno is actually probably a frustrated town planner, and one day we'll hopefully get him to apply for a placement in a local authority planning department. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Finn. And now our next speaker is the Global Director of Sustainability from Cundall, and so please welcome Amie Shuttleworth.
So I took the brief a lot more literally than others, and I really tried to think about who, yeah, here you go, the slides are up, who actually inspired me throughout my career. And I don't come from a design background, as it sounds like many people here actually do. I'm an environmental scientist, and then worked really, I suppose, at the coalface on construction sites for many years before going into more of a leadership position. So I just thought I'd tell you a bit more about that very personal story. So you're not going to probably hear anything quite so intellectual as the previous speakers now, so forgive me. So this person here, as I'm sure everyone knows, I was actually put in front of in the early 1980s by my mum. I think she needed something to distract me, but he really actually became my hero when I was younger. To the point where when I was in primary school and was asked to bring in pictures of who my hero was, whilst my colleagues were bringing in Batman, Superman, etc., I brought in a book of David Attenborough and got laughed at. But he really gave me a love of nature, and actually something that's always stuck with me is the intrinsic value of nature that he really truly believes in. I don't know if anyone here saw the interview that Barack Obama did with David Attenborough, but Barack asked him, so what made you interested in nature? And his response was, well, actually, all children are born with an innate interest in nature, but adults just lose that, and he never lost it. And really, I feel that bringing nature into the living room into my life is what inspired me to want to protect nature. And then when I joined McAlpines in 2003, my hero, who I couldn't find a picture of, I could only find the back of his head, so I apologise. His name was Nick Wright, and he was the site foreman. I was only 21, he took me under his wing, and he taught me to communicate with the guys on site. I'm talking about really basic things here, that I was helping to segregate waste. And back in the day, if you went from 10% to 30%, that was absolutely brilliant. So you can see how long ago that actually was. But what he did is he communicated to the guys on site how important it was in various means, which I probably can't recount here because I'll probably get told off for swearing. But it was that a leader that people respect and that people really believe in makes a huge difference when you're trying to integrate sustainability into things that actually no one has ever heard of. My next leader is also from my McAlpine days. His name's Tim Hare. You probably know his projects. They were the likes of New Street Square, Quadrant 3, Bloomberg, and I had the honour of working with him on a couple of those projects, Quadrant 3 and Bloomberg. But he inspired me to sort of press on past the construction site and actually help work with designers, because there's a lot of design and build projects that I worked on. So things like healthier materials. But the thing that he really pushed home was that diversity was extremely important to him. And to having a strong team. I mean, he was managing thousands of people on a construction site, but he really put his money where his mouth is. He, time after time, had the most diverse teams, and those women went on to do things like the concrete package manager of the Olympic 2012 stadium. And this approach enabled him, as I said, to have roles as project director on the Bloomberg European headquarters, which just won the most sustainable building of the year awards, and also the Sterling Prize. But that view of diversity that actually creates the best team is something that really struck me, and it stayed with me. And I've included that as part of a sustainability strategy I've just curated for Cundall. Now, the next person people actually probably know, Cristina Figueres, who negotiated COP21. We have similarities, both female, both mothers. But I went to see her speak at the World Sustainable Built Environment conference in Hong Kong, where I actually live. I don't live in London. And she was incredibly inspiring. Not only in terms of the tenacity and the way that she talked, and she persuaded all of these people in this room, to strive to contribute towards this 1.5 degree target. But also that collaboration was very important, because it was the way that she spoke. When she was speaking to ministers, she talked about energy security. But when she spoke to what's another one that what's stuck in my mind? Finance. She would talk about things like how sustainable investments have lower risk, for example. So I think that was, she is definitely one of my heroes because of her ability to communicate. So who are the next David Attenboroughs? Well, I think a lot of people have already said this. It's actually the next generation. I do quite a lot of STEM volunteering back at my old school where I grew up in Hong Kong. And actually you'll be incredibly impressed at the kind of ideas that these kids come up with because they're not bound by the kind of values that we had when we were younger. So they're the future leaders of businesses, governments. Let's think about how we can all be the leaders for them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amie. And our next speaker is Stuart Robinson. He's Strategic Planning Advisor at TfL and is involved in developing a lot of public land where we need to deliver lots of housing to meet the Mayor's targets.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. So, my hero is Jan Gehl. Has anybody heard of Jan Gehl? Professor Jan Gehl? 1, him, 2, 3, 4. Well, I know you're paying a panel about it. So, yeah, he's my hero. And for those of you who don't know him, here's a picture of him here on his wedding day. Now, the fact that he got married is not particularly significant, but the person he got married to is. Because whilst he was studying architecture in Copenhagen, Jan was fortunate to marry a young psychologist. And that psychologist sort of went through all his difficult years at university and kept on asking him about architecture and said, from her perspective, I find it really strange, Jan, that you architects never design for people. And of course, Jan said, well, how preposterous. I mean, of course, we all design for people. To which she said, well, if you design for people, then why do you come up with things like this? And that got him thinking, because maybe people, architects have lost the art of designing for people. And so that set him on a train of his life, which I would like to think has influenced certainly 1 or 2 members of the panel, 1 or 2 people out there, to know who he is. He has currently got 1 book which is translated in 40 different languages, all based on the single premise that it's the first important thing in design is life. Design for life, design for people. The second most important thing is the space that we all occupy. The nature of that is absolutely fundamental, and it's certainly far more important than the buildings which then should come after. So that's basically Jan Gehl's treatise in one. And I was very fortunate to meet him about 30 years ago when he came over to England to help us, when I was working for the Crown Estate, look at refurbishing Regent Street. He also met with the Grosvenor to ask them about how to improve the Grosvenor Estate. And he's subsequently gone all over the world. There's hardly a major city in the world that's untouched. And how does he do it? Well, it's very, very basic, really. Because what makes one person happy and one person unhappy? What's the difference between a happy mouse and an unhappy mouse? Well, when scientists look at this, it's quite easy. Because if you put a mouse in a cage which has no stimulation, its actually brain does not develop. If you put a mouse in a cage full of things to do, its brain's developed. And it's just the same for us. If we're put in an environment which is very stimulating, which provides us with lots of interest, then we like it. If, on the other hand, we get put in a place like this, then perhaps not so. Even though, interestingly, the two are the same. So Jan went on to then develop his criteria of what makes a place interesting. And he basically looked at everything that you would know in Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Because, let's face it, this is all about being a human being. So he converted that Maslow's theory of needs into looking at the human environment. And of course, basically put it into 3 stages. The first need is protection, safe security. Once you've got over that, you can then look at the comfort factor. The third thing is all about this stimulation and enjoyment. So that's the key thing to design. And being stuck in a commercial agency, which I spent 30 of my years away with CBRE, I kept on asking the agent, saying, why don't you do more for the public realm? It will make you money. And I couldn't really prove it, but I knew it was true. So I contacted Jan Gehl about 3 or 4 years ago and persuaded him to do a study. And we looked at places like Times Square in New York. And everybody knows that in Times Square there was a massive change when they managed to persuade Bloomberg to chuck the cars out. And in fact, they did it over a weekend at first because everybody in New York had great doubts. And all they did was paint the road and put up some garden furniture. But it was such a success that the city were convinced to keep it going. Unfortunately, for those people who have real estate, there was a massive, massive change. So increased pedestrianisation, increased safety, it was good for retail, it was good for absolutely everything. And as a result, real estate values went up. So if I were to leave a message with you, the motto, what you in your business life, if you want to improve your environment, convince those who are investing in it that if you invest in people, it'll be good for their business. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. And now our final speaker, before we get down to a bit of Q&A and a discussion, is, I think, a heroic figure in himself, in that Bill Dunster, who's principal of the ZEDfactory, designed the bedstead scheme down in South London, which was a really trend-setting idea of how you deliver sustainable environments. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Bill Dunster to the stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, thank you for giving the opportunity to speak. How do I start the slides? I wanted to very quickly try and advocate that what's been so important is the idea that we can design our way out of our current problems. The future we can find a way by intelligence, by understanding building physics, by understanding the urban metabolism, by understanding how fragile we are as a species. And we really have to stop thinking that we can power our way out of our current energy, food, environmental crisis. And this leadership has been hard won. The ideas that create a future that works have evolved over a very long time. But they've also been responses to crises which have been very much evident and caused action from leading people leading social debate and having a dream of a future that could be better and more equitable and fairer and offer a significant increase in quality of life. And I'd like to start with the first person, George Peabody, who was the American ambassador to London in the 1850s, and he was appalled by the slums in the East End, and he set up the Peabody Trust. Years and years and years later, Peabody Trust owned literally thousands of homes in London. Their design director, Dickin Robinson, commissioned this scheme that is on the table, which on the screen now, which is BedZ, which was one of the first attempts certainly in an urban area in the UK to create a prototype zero carbon, zero waste lifestyle. It wasn't just about architecture, it's not just about building physics, it's not just about details and insulation and heat recovery, ventilation and solar panels and biomass combined heat and power plants. It was a genuine attempt to see how you could house 3.5 million people without losing any of the existing stocks of green agricultural land. So you had to fit them on the areas of available brownfield land. And the idea that a social housing provider based to a charity could commission this kind of bravado when all around us, including Prince of Wales and so on, advocating classical architecture, this new agenda for beauty coming back. I think this dream that a social housing provider could design a better future is and that's followed by people like Octavia Hill, Herbert Girardet, E.F. Schumacher, the Chinese housing minister Chao Bao-ching, who's been one of the most technically proficient politicians we've ever come across, and people then going on like Matthias Wagner-Knackel from the invented carbon footprinting. We've got people like Thomas Herzog developing an architecture that is worthy of certainly the 20th century and moving on to the 21st. And then finally producing the kind of legislation such as the BRE Code for Sustainable Homes, which was going to be mandatory in 2016. Those are my heroes, and we're still at it. We're still trying to make a zero-carbon future that works. We're here at the show with a prototype for homes that can be built by very low-skilled people. It's been built in a sixth-form college in Basildon, and it's got cladding components which can be used to retrofit existing buildings, and we're doing this all over the world. And we believe the original vision of a zero-carbon future that actually works is totally deliverable, and we all have to make a big effort to make it work. Otherwise, the future is dysfunction and aggression and nationalism and all sorts of conflict, which was totally unnecessary. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill. So we're going to have a little conversation amongst ourselves for a moment, and then hopefully you'll have some questions to ask our panel. And I'd just like to start off by picking up some of my heroes, which were mentioned during the various talks. I agree with Stuart that Jan Gehl is a heroic figure, and the way he's changed our cities, made them more sustainable. I always like the way you showed that image looking down onto a rather empty housing estate, and it's what Jan Gehl calls bird shit planning, which is everything is planned from sort of 500 meters up rather than at ground level. And I always find that a very inspiring comment. Marie-Louise talked about one of the first houses, sustainable houses, built in 1977 as a result of the oil crisis in the early 70s. My hero in that context is a chap called Alex Pike, who was teaching sustainable design in Cambridge School of Architecture, and he built the autonomous house in Cambridge with Ken Yang, who then went on to become a very celebrated architect dealing with sustainable buildings. That was back in 1973, so it's worth looking that one up. But my best hero that was mentioned is actually Stuart Brand, who Finn mentioned, and I would put together with Stuart Brand actually Alec Gordon, who was president of the RIBA. It's one of the best things probably any president of the RIBA has ever said. They don't say a lot, you might say worth remembering, but he talked about long life, loose fit, low energy. And so that whole concept of how buildings learn, and a very nice quote from Finn saying, when the building is finished, is it the end or is it really just the beginning? I think that we do have to look at how we are talking about the beginning once we finish the building. And certainly looking at some of the buildings that have been created by your practice at Bennetts, looking back to RAB, working on Broadgate, where HM are just now doing up a building that was designed back in 1984, incredibly flexible, able to meet all the necessary changes in technology and work and so on, and still be a very flexible and positive building. And I would also say that Bill mentioned E.F. Schumacher, who was a great chap. I knew him quite well. Small is Beautiful. He wrote a book, and a long time ago I worked for Architectural Design magazine. He used to write for us regularly. Two other people associated with that: Colin Ward, who was an anarchist, who actually was one of the real driving forces of change in the way we did of housing at that time, and of course Walter Siegel, who is really only now celebrated for a relatively small scheme or two schemes in Lewisham, but amazingly influential, and one wish he had been able to go on and do a lot more of that. So that brings me to the Smithsons. You mentioned the Smithsons as well as Lou Betkin, and I would say one of my problems with those is that those buildings are so fixed, and I would say that was one of the reasons I could not support the campaign to save Robin Hood Gardens. I remember I visited Robin Hood Gardens the first day it was open, and all the people moving in, they couldn't even hang a picture on a wall because they'd used this shuttered concrete finish, no plaster, so people were desperately trying to bang nails into concrete. This was before the time you could go to B&Q and buy a hammer drill to get into concrete, and they were frustrated right from the start. It was not the sort of interactive environment that I think that Stuart Brown would have liked, or Jan Gehl would have liked, or Walter Siegel would have liked. So anyway, so I've been lucky. So I've had lots of heroes. Do you not think that housing needs to be responsive to changing environment? We need to be able to be flexible. Building fixed buildings which can't be changed is an issue?
Absolutely. It's similar now with the sort of Metsec wall construction and concrete frame. I mean, how truly flexible are they? I'm not sure. We're sort of, in my previous role at Levitt Bernstein, we were looking at the Grenfell estate and looking at kind of improvements that you could make there, and a lot of the kind of setting out of staircases and things that you do that are fixed, and lifts really plays forward so many years, and then sort of determines what you're going to be able to do in terms of refitting houses. I suppose with Metsec you've got some flexibility, but some things are fixed. I think one thing I would say about future flexibility is I live in a small one bed, and it's wonderful. It's pocket. I've been able to afford to buy my own home at quite a young age. I feel very privileged. But I think now that we've all been there about 4 or 5 years, everybody's starting to have babies, and everyone's stuck in a tiny one bed. So I wonder whether maybe something for the future is thinking about not building so many small one bed flats, because that's not necessarily so future-proof as we think.
Yeah, thanks. So Simon, I mean, you obviously deliver this to commercial buildings a lot. You haven't done quite so much housing though, but
I mean, I think if you look at London's housing stock, some of the most adaptable buildings are actually the terraced houses from the 19th century and the 18th century, because we've got a very simple form of construction that's easily adapted. It can be turned into multiple occupancy, single occupancy. It has outdoor space. It can become workplace. And so, I mean, I know that I guess it's difficult to imagine an economic model for building housing like that now, but it has proven to be extremely resilient, which is why there's so much of it around. And actually the densities that you can achieve through that kind of medium rise, traditional construction are actually pretty high, I think. So I would advocate for a future where maybe there was more density and lower scale as a more flexible long-term way of looking at certain parts of the city, maybe not the core, but maybe the wider outer city that needs to develop too.
So Marie-Louise, I mean, one of the reasons why I like the whole idea of how buildings learn is that the circular economy is now something which is being taken very seriously. part of mayoral policy. We're going to deliver more, and flexibility is an essential part of that, isn't it?
Yes, definitely, and it's in all of our minds. We're all talking about it very much. I'm not sure I've seen enough examples of the true circular economy, and there are a lot of things getting in its way at the moment. But yes, very interesting conversation about flexibility in off-site housing, for example, and whether that would limit or is actually a new opportunity to reinvent the way we design houses and having buyers more involved in the design and the ambitions for their changes and growth in the future, so that they're not forced to move home as over time, which is something that happens all the time, and it's one of the biggest constraints and stresses of society.
Yeah. Finn, so I mean, you obviously have this London-wide view of what's happening, and the mayor has a plan to make us zero carbon by 2050, I believe. Has he got a hope?
Well, I think, firstly, that's a bit too late, isn't it? You know, we've got 12 years, really, to do something about this. And I think there is a big momentum now, potentially building up behind council-led housing delivery, a huge opportunity to reinvent the way we do that. But then there are equally huge pressures, whether it's the mantra from government about more, better, faster, which for me rings of a kind of right here, right now attitude, rather than thinking more, longer term about what we do. Or the inevitable pressure to do things cheaply, which is, lay behind a lot of those mistakes, as Zohra pointed out, in the last generation. So I think we've got to be really careful with the use of modern methods of construction when we've got a pipeline already of 26,000 council-led homes in London, and that's only growing with the mayor's home building capacity funding and things. So there's a big opportunity there. But going back to the question whether we've got a hope, that's not necessarily going to happen with new builds. That's got to happen with existing properties. So actually one of the placements I'm most excited about in our new cohort of 38 associates who start in April is an architect who's being placed in Enfield Council's maintenance department. And they're going to be leading on a £40 million retrofit programme, because Enfield has the most tower blocks built with systems building in the 1970s. And the idea of really treating that as a design challenge and thinking how you can build in sustainability to the existing housing stock we've got, I think has to be where we start.
Yeah, thanks. Tell us a bit about I didn't realise you lived in Hong Kong before we started. So, Finn talked about more, better, faster. They certainly do more and better in Hong Kong and mainland China. Are they now doing it better as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say better in Hong Kong than London. China is absolutely powering away. When they set legislation, everybody acts immediately, and they are definitely one to watch. So some of the projects we've been working on there, it's actually been mandatory to do prefabrication for 70%. And that's just, the government said it, everyone does it, and they react. And it's actually not necessarily for the circular economy reasons, it's actually because of air pollution. It's such a big concern in terms of all the urbanisation that's happening in the cities. That's actually one of the biggest drivers. In Hong Kong, actually it's the retrofitting element which is the most important, because they tried to do so much building in the early 90s before the handover to China. That a lot of that stock's quite inefficient, they don't have any insulation, double glazing, etc. So that's where actually the Construction Industry Council is really focusing at the moment. And they do try and look to cities like London and Europe to try and learn from, which is good, it's positive.
Thank you very much. And Stuart, there are two interesting lessons from Hong Kong. One is the funding of development is based on a Hong Kong model now, that you can actually, for things like Crossrail 2, take the land value capture to start paying for it. But also, you're looking at developing around TfL stations, which allows you to provide high-density living with very good sustainable connections, so nobody needs a car, and you can deliver a sustainable environment.
Yes, one of my big hopes for the latter in developing London is clearly the big challenge is raising density in the suburbs. And fortunately, around the stations in outer London, there is land, that we have land. But the big challenge is creating places, because we cannot afford for people to carry on travelling inward commuting at the level even if we are able to deal with things like Crossrail 2 or whatever, we need to create better places in the suburbs for which people can feel happy not having to commute. And going back to my hero, Yangel, I think the key there is to create civic spaces around those stations which provide a focus, a welcoming. We've seen it done. I mean, King's Cross is probably the best example of the world of creating good public space around stations which inspire people, which encourage people to stay, to rest, to spend, to invest, to live. And that's what I hope that we can do, perhaps in a smaller scale, but throughout suburbs of London. To go to your first point about Hong Kong, though, we don't have the type of legislation which allows the refunding, refinance model which MIT has in China. And we create problems for ourselves, as we've seen with HS2, in that we build a line, or the new line, on a very tight red line boundary, and then we expect all of the benefits and the recharge of money back to the infrastructure project to come from a very narrow red line. Well, of course, what these infrastructure projects is doing, as the Jubilee line has showed, is that these benefits are spread over a much wider area. And until we can really get our heads around that, the whole financing system is broken.
Thank you very much. And finally, Bill, we go back to China for a moment. I remember seeing you very bravely putting on an exhibit in the Shanghai Expo to get the Chinese to buy lots of Z buildings of various kinds. So how did it go? And now are you building millions in China, or did it?
Well,
did it work out?
We're just getting going, and it's humbling to see every single Chinese city manufactures their own photovoltaics. The renewable energy industry has changed the world. They're really getting to grips with all these ideas. The most imaginative urban design is now coming from Chinese politicians rather than European. They are overtaking us in most respects. We're doing solar farms over streets in central China. I couldn't even dream propose that to a London urban designer. So I think, their economies of scale, they're changing their industry, they're rethinking it, and they could solve their problems. We just need other national leaders to show the same enlightened direction.
Very good. Well, that's a good thing to hear. So, let's go to the floor and see who would like to ask our excellent panel a question or two. Anybody? Yes, thank you very much. I think we've got a microphone coming so that everyone can hear you. The others coming the other side? No, you're being chased. That's it.
Well, I have to apologise. I'm not an architect, but my father was a quantity surveyor, and I was fascinated by the fact that the first person mentioned was Bertold Lubetkin, because my father was his quantity surveyor, and they became very good friends. And we used to go off to building sites around London, public housing and so on, Islington. And I had no idea the significance then, but I did just want to point out that I heard a correlation between that and Mr. Dunstan's, designs. Because I remember my father saying that there was a concern, particularly in public housing, that there be green space, that there be facilities for people who were disabled. He spoke about that kind of stuff in the late 40s and early 50s, and it made an impression upon me now. So I think that was an excellent example of somebody who, I'm sure I know there were difficulties, but there is a direct continuity between everything that everybody's been saying about the environment that people, particularly in public housing, not necessarily, the fact that in Finsbury, the health centre, there were facilities that went beyond the most basics of seeing a doctor. It was somewhere to eat, somewhere to relax, but the green part of that goes way back.
Thank you very much. Do you want to comment on that? It was a statement rather than a question.
No, yeah, I agree. He's a wonderful hero of mine. So yeah.
Yes.
Oh yes. I think, Simon, you put a picture of Greta Thunberg up from Davos saying the house is on fire. I just want to challenge the panel. Are humans too selfish, or do we just lack the leadership to make the significant change for our future?
Very good. Right, who would like to start on that one? Stuart.
Yeah, I must say, I get very disenchanted by our leadership, and the longer this social media stuff, this is going to sound like an angry old man, isn't it? But what I think is so destructive is the soundbite, and goodness knows my attention span is low enough. But when all you're concentrating on is a short soundbite, then how can we address the here and now, as Finn so eloquently exposed, to at least think beyond the next 4 or 5 years, or at least into the next electoral cycle?
I mean, there's definitely been this very visible speeding up of the news cycle, which feeds into political decision making. Now, even in the last 4 or 5 in my career anyway, from expecting to see the news once a day in a newspaper to being disappointed if the homepage of the website you're looking at hasn't refreshed in the last half an hour, to checking the feed on your social media account, and that inevitably feeds a shorter term way of thinking. But at the same time, it can be a tool to mobilize people around a certain issue, particularly if those people are incentivized to think in the long term. And there's no one, there's no kind of group of society who are able to think genuinely long term than children who aren't caught up in those those kind of more immediate pressures. And that's been, I think, an extraordinary thing to see over the last half a year, and is already starting to send shockwaves across decision makers. But I think, I can see it happening in even things like the much more superficial things, in a way, like the kind of trends you start to see coming out in architecture schools, or the Oslo Architecture Triennale is looking at the theme of degrowth or no growth. You've got extraordinary practices like Rota, based in Brussels, doing really innovative work around the circular economy. And it's not a kind of hair shirt alternative. That's the coolest thing that young architects and designers are doing right now. So I think something is genuinely changing, and it's encouraging.
Thanks. Amie?
I do think that people are selfish, but actually I think that's a positive thing, because at the moment, particularly in places like where I live again, we're seeing such extreme climate events on such a regular basis that's driving investment into both climate adaptation and mitigation at extortionate rates. So people do want to protect what they've got, and in order to do that, they're realising that they're going to have to invest to be part of that collaborative effort. So that's sort of my observation.
Thanks. Bill?
Yeah, I'd like to say...
I think you've got a mic there.
I'd like to say that enlightened self-interest is likely to save the day, and people are not stupid, and they really will do something about it. And if politicians and really don't understand the scale of the problem and don't understand how angry certainly the next generation is becoming, they're going to get bitten. And the smart thing is not to walk into these confrontations, but to listen, do something about it, plan, and we'll design our way out of this mess. And it's not, it's a cultural change, which is exciting.
Great. Anybody else comment on that? No? Right, another question, comment, point anyone like to make? Well, then I'll pick up, because we've got 2 people on the panel who have moved into the public sector. When I was a young architect, 50% of the architectural profession, well, he has too, yes, that's it, but yeah, okay, 3 then, that 50% of the architectural profession and many other professional services were actually in the public sector. That, of course, disappeared, but the sort of move is speeding up with you two, Vincent, you've got Ken Rorison at Hackney, and as high profiles, but I guess lots of other people are now seeing this, younger people seeing this as a really positive way forward in a career.
I think so. It's probably worth letting people in architecture school know that there's so many jobs out there for local authorities, and they're really very rewarding and quite broad. What I've really found is sort of the scope of what I can get involved with is just so exciting. Everything from sort of small scale, really getting involved in a new mural on a wall that people really love and engaging with local artists, up to sort of really looking at a whole neighbourhood and how we're going to fit in thousands of new homes that we need in a sustainable way. And that kind of flip and scale it in just one day is not something that architects normally have the pleasure of doing, when you're sort of working on one project for 2 or 3 years. So it's a really exciting thing. So if there's young people out there thinking about making the move, I'd really recommend it.
Very good. And presumably, Finn, you're in a good position to see the enthusiasm for this through people applying for your practice.
Yeah, well, we've, at the minute, we've had annual intakes. First intake, we had over 200 applicants, and not just architects, planners, environmental specialists, people with expertise in housing delivery, consultation, engagement, and those are the kind of new sets of skills, a new approach that's perhaps more interdisciplinary that we really need, that often doesn't sit within one set department of a council, but operates between different teams, breaks down silos, and kind of rewires the way councils work. So the placements we put forward for those kind of people, I think 90% of them are brand new roles. They just simply didn't exist before. So it's not just a case of kind of filling existing vacancies, and there are a lot of vacancies. At the latest count, there are 800 vacancies and temporary agency roles in planning departments in London.
Really?
A few months ago.
Well,
so the money is there for those roles.
Yeah, lifting the borrowing cap has just...
Yeah.
Councils now have this new kind of mandate to get building and...
But they're not necessarily able to link that with the kind of the additional expertise they need. That's not to say there aren't lots of brilliant people within local authorities already, but we need more of them, clearly. And I think we're seeing now the latest round of applications we had again over 220 applicants. We're double the size of our cohort to nearly 40, and we'll be launching another round now that will start in October that aligns with the Mayor's Home Building Capacity Fund, which is another £10 million worth of funding that will go directly into supporting new roles within local authorities. So I think the opportunity here is not just to kind of plug gaps in the development management system, process the machine faster and faster, but it really is reinvent the way we plan, and that's what's exciting about this generation of roles that are coming forward from really forward-thinking authorities like, Stuart's team at TfL hosted one associate in the first cohort. They've come back for 2, and in the next round, and that's helping TfL work in different ways. Stuart's much better places.
It's easier if I tell you how good you are. And I would highly recommend public practice for those of you out there in the audience who are thinking, well, maybe this may be something for me. I would really commend it. I didn't talk in my talk about future heroes, but having met the cohort that Finn's just produced, I am sure that one of the future heroes is going to come, well, at least one from that cohort. They're actually a fantastic group of people. The guy that we've had at TfL has really changed and made a material change in the way that the property development team has worked, is thinking, and as Finn says, we're getting 2 next year. So absolutely fantastic. Well done, Finn.
Very good. Well, we're just about up to time, so that seems a very good point on which to stop the younger people moving to public practice, obviously heroic figures in themselves, and our heroic speakers this afternoon coming to tell us about their experiences, and you heroic people in the audience for being here so late in the evening, when I'm sure there are cocktail parties going on all over the building. So thank you very much indeed, and do thank our speakers in the usual way. Thank you.